Good evening. Tonight we are going to look a little bit at comparing decimals. That's going to be our first topic for the fourth quarter. We're going to be on this for a week, and we'll move on to measurement and metric and customary after that. So tonight we're going to look a little bit at comparing decimals, excuse me. And so what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've put down 4 decimals on my whiteboard. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and share a couple tips about how to compare different decimals, how to put them in order, how to figure out which one is greater than the other, greatest to least, etc., whatever you need to do. So remember that most of the time when you're dealing with a decimal, it's similar to dealing with a fraction. You're dealing with part of a whole. So before I do anything, what I actually look at when I'm comparing my decimals is I look to see if I have any whole numbers. A lot of times people get caught up in the number of numbers that are in the decimal. So for example, this bottom number here has 0.17. This has 1.70. And then if you look all the way up here at the top, this has 0.7, 7/10. This one's 17 hundredths, 1 and 70 hundredths. And remember, the thing with it though is it doesn't necessarily matter the size of the number as far as how many digits it goes. So the main thing you want to do is focus on reading your numbers going from the left to the right. Okay? So if I look at my 4 numbers here that I have, if I start on the left side, there's one number that's clearly greater than the others because that is a whole number, which means that, a lot of the times when we deal with decimals, we're dealing with less than 1. We're dealing with a part, similar to a fraction. But in this case, if you look at this decimal right here, you have 1 and 70 hundredths. So this 1 makes this the biggest number here. So if I were comparing these or putting this in order, that would clearly be the biggest decimal that's on my board here. Okay, so once I get that, remember I'm reading left to right. So I'm going to go ahead and look at my next digit. So if I look at my next digit, I have, of my 3 decimals I have left, I have a 7, a 7, and a 1. So because I'm looking at this digit now, I know that these two are equal. This one is smaller. So if I were comparing these, I can already tell you that this last one's the smallest because it has no whole number, so it's smaller than that. And then these 2 decimals up here have a 7 in the 10th spot. This one has a 1, so I know it's automatically the smallest. Which brings us to these top 2. So if you look at these, I'm reading left to right. And this is another place where a lot of people get stuck. So they both had a 0 as a whole number. They both have a 7 in the 10th spot. And then you get to the 100th spot. This number, 71 hundredths, has a 1 in the hundredths. 7/10 has no hundredths. But what you can do is anytime you have decimals that aren't the same size, you can put a placeholder or fill them in until they're the same size. So I can put a 0 down, and in this case now I have 70 hundredths, 71 hundredths. So looking at this, 71 is greater than 70. So if I were putting these in order, this would be the second biggest. This would be the third biggest. So that's one way to do it. Another strategy that some people like to do is, if I erase that and change it back, some people like to look at it as fractions, and they'll actually convert their decimals to fractions. So they'll go 7/10, 71 hundredths, 1 and 70 hundredths, 17 hundredths. And once you do that, again, you're going to come down to the same thing where these 2 numbers are really close to each other. But this number, since it's a mixed number, is clearly the biggest. And this number, it's a teeny tiny fraction. If you remember last quarter, we talked about benchmarking and looking at the fractions and thinking about them as, are they more than half or less than half? These two fractions up here are clearly greater than half. This fraction down here is clearly a lot less than a half. So again, this would be the smallest. And then these two, you could just take this, and if you guys remember the equivalent fractions, you can take the 10, turn it to 100, take the 7, turn it into a 70, and again you have the same comparison where you can take them and compare them. So that's basically how you're going to compare decimals. So remember that as you're comparing your decimals, you're going to read left to right, check for your whole numbers, start with your tenths, go to your hundredths. Remember that if your hundredths place, if there's a number missing a hundredths place, that's going to help you compare better. You can, add a 0 in as your placeholder. If you want a different strategy, you can turn them into fractions, and remember your benchmarking and what you did last quarter. Think about, if it's a mixed number, has that whole number, again, obviously it's going to be bigger. Look at them, compare them, convert them, and do what works for you. So that's what we're going to spend our beginning of our week doing with decimals. Thank you.